John had been in the funeral business for over a decade, and he prided himself on his attention to detail. Every step, the checklists, the routes, the loading, had become second nature to him. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet precision that didn't need to be showy, just respectful and reliable. It was early spring about 5 years ago. The trees stood bare, but the sun lingered a little longer each day, softening the chill. John was tasked with transporting a casket for a midday service. The woman inside was in her early 60s, a well-loved figure who'd passed after a long illness. Her family had chosen a simple maple casket. No frills, just tasteful modesty, as she'd wanted. John performed his usual pre-departure checks at the funeral home. Tires, fuel, interior, and the latch. He pressed it down, tested the lock, and confirmed it was secure. He'd done this hundreds of times without a hitch. But halfway to the cemetery, John felt it, a subtle shift in the vehicle. He knew the route well, Maine to Clearwater, then up toward Westfield Memorial. The roads were familiar, every turn and pothole mapped in his mind. This wasn't a bump. Something wasn't right. He pulled over, stepped out, and checked the back. Sure enough, the latch had popped open. The door wasn't ajar, but it wasn't sealed either. Surprised, he closed it firmly, heard the click, and tugged to test it. Locked. He drove on. 5 minutes later, it happened again. John stopped, checked, and found the latch undone once more. He ran through possibilities: a faulty mechanism, heat expansion, or something caught inside. He called the funeral home to confirm the casket hadn't shifted during loading. Everything was fine, they said. Still, it nagged at him. On the third stop, he went over every detail, cleared the lock, reset the seal, and added a backup strap for good measure. This time, it held. The rest of the trip was smooth. At the cemetery, the family gathered graveside. As John prepared the casket for offloading, the daughter approached him. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. She hated enclosed spaces, she said. She had this fear her whole life, couldn't stand tight spots. She made me promise to tell someone, just in case. John nodded, his thoughts snapping back to that stubborn latch. He wasn't one for ghost stories, but the coincidence stuck with him. That latch had never failed before, or since. The service ended quietly, and John stayed to tidy up. He checked the latch one last time, solid, unyielding, as if nothing had happened. In his line of work, some things defied explanation. He didn't dwell on it, but he couldn't shake the feeling. Maybe that door had needed to breathe just enough for her. Margaret had been a funeral director for over 15 years, her days shaped by the steady rhythm of solemn duties. She thrived on the quiet precision of it all, checking caskets, coordinating with families, ensuring every detail honored the departed. The work demanded respect, and she gave it freely, her calm demeanor a steady anchor for grieving families. It was a damp November morning when Margaret oversaw the burial of Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a widow in her late 70s who'd passed peacefully at home. The cemetery, Crestwood Memorial, sat on the edge of town, its old stones worn smooth by time and weather. Margaret knew the place well, its paths and plots as familiar as her own heartbeat. The service was small: Evelyn's 2 daughters, a handful of neighbors, and a pastor who kept his words brief. As the group gathered around the open grave, Margaret stood back, her eyes scanning the scene out of habit. That's when she noticed her, a woman in a faded gray dress, standing alone near a cluster of headstones some 30 yards away. She was older, her posture stiff, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. No coat, no scarf, bareheaded despite the biting wind. Margaret assumed she was a latecomer, perhaps a friend of Evelyn's who hadn't made the guest list. But something nagged at her. No one else seemed to see the woman. The daughters wept softly. The neighbors murmured condolences, yet not a single head turned toward the figure in gray. Margaret blinked, and the woman was still there, staring silently at the proceedings. The ceremony ended without incident. As the family drifted back to their cars, Margaret glanced again. The woman had moved closer, now standing just beyond the tent, her expression unreadable. Margaret's pulse quickened, though she kept her composure. She approached the groundskeeper, a gruff man named Hal, and asked if he'd seen her. "What lady?" he grunted, squinting in the direction she pointed. The space was empty now. No sign of the woman, no footprints in the soft, damp earth. Back at the office, curiosity gnawed at Margaret. She pulled the records for Evelyn's plot and found something odd. The neighboring grave, unmarked save for a weathered placeholder, belonged to a Clara Evans, buried a year prior. Clara had been Evelyn's older sister, the file noted. No service, no family present, just a quiet interment arranged by the county. The sisters had lived together for decades, neighbors said, until Clara's sudden death. Margaret returned to the cemetery that evening, the air heavy with mist. She stood by Clara's unmarked plot, half expecting nothing. Then, in the stillness, she heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. It came from Evelyn's fresh grave, steady and deliberate, then stopped as abruptly as it began. She didn't jump to conclusions. Margaret wasn't the type. But as she walked away, the chill lingered. In her line of work, she'd learned that some bonds didn't end with death. Sometimes, the past stood watch, silent and unseen, waiting for its moment to be felt. I'm Sam, and after 18 years in the funeral trade, I've learned to expect the unexpected. Grief twists reality in ways you can't predict, but some moments stick with you, defying explanation. This one happened on a late spring morning, the kind where dogwoods bloom and the air feels too bright for sorrow. We were burying Mr. Roland Peters, an 83-year-old Army vet who'd lived a full life. 2 tours, Little League coach, church every Sunday. His daughter Jean, a school teacher with a warm handshake, had arranged it all. The service was at a Baptist church, white clapboard with an organ that wheezed through the hymns. The pews were full. Veterans, friends, grandkids in stiff shoes. Taps played outside. The flag folded crisp and clean. It was simple, dignified, just how he'd have wanted it. The cemetery sat 6 miles out, a straight shot down a quiet county road I'd driven dozens of times. 4 cars followed my hearse, Jean and her family in the lead. Her youngest kept peering back at me through the rear window, a curious shadow against the glass. 5 minutes in, their brake lights flared. They slowed, then stopped, dead center on the road. No warning, no reason. I eased to a halt, keeping my distance. Processions don't stop unless something's wrong. Then Jean's door flew open. She stumbled out, voice sharp with urgency. "That's him! That's Dad! He's in that car!" I stepped out, boots crunching gravel, and followed her gaze. She was pointing to the field beside us. Nothing but soybeans stretching to the horizon. No car, no figure, just empty green under a clear sky. "I saw him," she insisted, tears spilling over. "In a black car, ahead of us. He looked at me, like he didn't want me to cry." Her brother tried to calm her, but she shook him off, trembling. It took time to get her back in the car, her hands unsteady as she gripped the seat. We rolled on in silence, heavy and thick, the kind that lingers when no one knows what to say. At the cemetery, the burial was quiet. The family stood close, heads bowed, and soon they drifted away. Jean lingered, approaching me as the grounds crew waited in the distance. "I'm not crazy," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I know what I saw." I nodded, offering a quiet word. It's not my place to judge, just to carry the dead and support the living. Driving back, I checked my mirrors out of habit. The road was empty, no black car, just fading light and the hum of tires. I have seen grief do strange things, make shadows dance, voices whisper. But this felt different. Jean's certainty, the way she'd pointed at nothing and seen everything. Maybe Roland found a way to say goodbye, to ease her pain one last time. In this job, you learn some things don't need answers. Roads carry more than traffic, and every so often someone glimpses what the rest of us miss. I don't dwell on it, don't dismiss it either. I just keep driving, steady and respectful, knowing not all weight shows on the scale. Evelyn had been in the funeral industry for over a decade, long enough to treat every step of the process like second nature. The checklists, the routes, the calls, the loading, especially the loading, had a rhythm to them, a quiet precision that didn't need to be flashy, just respectful and reliable. It was a cold, overcast day in late autumn when Evelyn oversaw the burial of Mr. Harold Green, an 82-year-old man who had died alone in his small, cluttered apartment. The service was modest, held at Oakwood Memorial, an old cemetery on the outskirts of town. The place had a melancholy beauty, with its ancient oaks and rows of weathered headstones, many so old their inscriptions were barely legible. Only a handful of people attended, distant relatives who had barely known Harold, their faces more puzzled than sorrowful. The pastor, a young man with a nervous stutter, rushed through the prayers, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Evelyn stood to the side, her black coat buttoned tight against the chill, her eyes scanning the scene out of habit. That's when she saw her. A woman standing at the far edge of the cemetery, near a cluster of crooked graves. She was tall and thin, dressed in a long, dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. Her clothing seemed outdated, like something from the 1950s, and she stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the burial. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She had seen many things in her years of service, grieving families, unexpected guests, even the occasional protester. But this woman felt different. There was an aura of stillness around her, as if she belonged to another time. As the service concluded, and the family began to drift back to their cars, Evelyn made her way toward the woman. Her boots crunched on the frost-covered grass, but when she reached the spot, the woman was gone. Evelyn turned in a slow circle, scanning the cemetery, but there was no sign of her. No footprints, no broken twigs, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. Back at the funeral home, Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about the woman. She decided to check the cemetery's records, something she rarely did, but curiosity got the better of her. After an hour of searching through dusty files, she found a mention of Margaret Green, Harold's older sister. According to the records, Margaret had disappeared in 1968, leaving behind only rumors and unanswered questions. A faded photograph clipped to the file showed a tall, slender woman with sharp features and a penchant for vintage fashion. Evelyn stared at the photo, her breath catching in her throat. It was the woman she had seen, down to the hat and coat. That night, as Evelyn drove home through the quiet streets, she replayed the day's events in her mind. She wasn't one to believe in ghosts, but she couldn't deny what she had seen. Perhaps Margaret had come to say goodbye to her brother, to be present in death as she couldn't be in life. In this line of work, you learn to respect the silence, to carry the living through their grief without judgment. And sometimes, you glimpse something else. Something that reminds you that not all stories end with the closing of a grave. Some linger, like a figure at the edge of a cemetery, waiting for their moment to be seen. I've been a funeral director for nearly 18 years, long enough to know that every procession has its own rhythm, a quiet cadence of respect and routine. Most days, it's clockwork, but some days, something else rides along. It was late October when we buried Mr. Harold Grayson, a retired mechanic in his late 70s. Heart failure took him quick. The service was simple, family only, headed to St. Agnes Cemetery just outside town. I'd driven that route 100 times, straight down Route 12, left onto Elm, up the hill. I prepped the hearse that morning, Mr. Grayson's steel casket secured, rear door locked. The family gathered at the chapel, and we set off just past noon. 4 cars followed, headlights dim in the daylight haze. Halfway up Elm, I felt it. A weight shift. Not the casket. I'd know that sound. This was subtler, like someone settling into the passenger seat. I glanced over. Empty. But the air felt thick, heavier than the damp chill outside. Then the radio crackled. It was off. I never play it during processions, but static hissed through the speakers. I tapped the power button. Nothing changed. The static grew, and beneath it, a voice. Not clear words, just a murmur, like someone speaking through water. I checked the volume. Still off, still murmuring. I pulled into St. Agnes and the sound stopped, clean, like a switch flipped. The family climbed out, faces drawn but composed. We carried Mr. Grayson to his rest. The burial went smooth. His wife lingered longest, tracing the casket's edge before nodding to me. Back at the funeral home, I asked our mechanic to check the radio. He found nothing. No shorts, no loose connections. "Works fine," he said, shrugging. The next day, Mrs. Grayson called to thank me. "He loved that old radio in his shop," she said, unprompted. "Always tinkering with it, picking up stations from miles away. Said it kept him company." I don't lean into ghost stories. I've seen too much grief twist perception. Too many coincidences line up just so. But I've driven that hearse since, and the radios stayed silent. Except that day. Sometimes, I wonder if Mr. Grayson hitched a ride, just for the trip up Elm. In this line of work, you learn to carry the dead with dignity. Every now and then, though, they remind you they're still along for the ride.